I'm here to talk to you about extreme product development. I'm going to describe some things that I think are extreme, and I'm not going to really tell you how to do them. My job today is to tell you that they exist. These are going to be things that I've been told are not possible. So I'm here today to tell you that some things that you could be doing at work are possible. If you're not, then your job is to figure out how. This is not about extreme sports. That's something completely different, apparently to do with doing things in midair. It's also not about extreme ironing, which is a whole other world. So it's not. The extreme, that the link I'm making is about extreme programming. Now, extreme programming has won, right? So 25 years ago, extreme programming was a list of techniques, practices that sounded and were extreme. Radical things like pair programming and test-driven development. People were pretty shocked at the time that you would suggest doing these things. The idea of extreme programming was to describe a brave new world of software development. So it won. These things are not extreme anymore. They're quite mainstream, in fact. And even if you're not doing all of these things, so these are most of the extreme programming practices, the rules of XP, if you like. Even if you're not doing most of these, you're probably doing some of them, and none of these really shock people anymore. So that's great. That's very good news for software development. This is the good kind of agile, not the other bad kind of agile. And it prompted me to think, if we've got past this, what is extreme today? What still counts as extreme techniques, or what are the new things that count as extreme techniques in software development? So I have 10 examples for you. These are things that I've been lucky enough to experience over the last mostly 4 years, working for a couple of different companies. And I was told they weren't possible, that they were not reasonable, that they were ridiculous. And I'm lucky enough to have actually got to make them part of my work. So, first up, not only working remote, but working remote for a remote-first company. So what this is about is a company that doesn't have offices. Now, the first time I thought about this idea, it was back in 2014. I thought I would go and work in London for 6 months because I live in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. My boss disagreed, said that's definitely not possible. You can't work from another country. That's ridiculous, he told me. So I quit because he disagreed. Did spend the 6 months in London, which turned out to be the most expensive holiday of my life. But it was very good, and I did get another job. And my next job turned out to be my first remote job. So I started working for a company remote. Now, it was not remote first, but in February 2015, then I started working from home. So I want to talk to you a bit about my experiences and why they're important for me, and why I think maybe there's something you can aspire to. Some of this might sound good to you. That's the idea. So what is the experience in a remote-first company? Since 2020, I work for companies with no office. Everything has to have a remote process, every business process, starting with hiring. You get recruited and hired into this company without meeting anybody, and one day a laptop arrives by courier, and then you start work. It just so happened that I did this the first time in late 2020. So because lockdown, I didn't meet any of my colleagues in person for 11 months. That was a very weird experience. But the moment I knew that this was really working was when we did first meet up. I met half the team in Frankfurt after 11 months in this job. It was kind of an anticlimax because we knew each other quite well already. We just hadn't done it in person. It was like meeting up with people you've known for years but haven't seen for a couple of weeks. Great experience. And so that sort of got me thinking about, okay, well, this seems to work. How is this working? Now, the big thing about this experience is no exceptions. So if you don't work in this fully remote environment, one day somebody's going to say, oh, well, we'll do that when you get to the office. Not being able to do that is what forces you to solve the remote problem in a much bigger way. Now, why do I care? My experience was this was much more flexible. It gave me the flexibility to avoid commuting, which is a big time, cost, environmental impact. and the flexibility to reorganize my day and whereabouts I would work. What's less obvious about this experience is the humanity of it. First, remote work filters out people who don't have their shit together and who can't organize themselves. But even less obvious than that is that remote-first companies are more humane, perhaps because remote work neutralizes asshole behavior. That's what I started thinking about, is that all of the toxic things about the offices I'd worked in, kind of hogging the best seat in the meeting room, you can't do that in an online meeting. It's much more democratic and inclusive. And that's the beginning of the thinking that led to what I'm telling you about today. How do you do this? As far as I can tell, my best advice, if you want to do this, is start a new company. It could be that a company out there has transformed into being fully remote successfully, but that's not my story to tell. I'm not saying it didn't happen, I just wasn't there. Now, the important practical things, when you're working remote, you need to make everything explicit. Like GitLab out there, go and talk to them about how they work fully remote. They have a handbook. Everything in GitLab is in the handbook. It makes it explicit how you work. One of them told me earlier, you might get a Slack message that correcting you if you're not really doing things the right way. That means you've been handbooked. Nice GitLab story. But mainly, it's about that doing things explicitly, but also being able to work asynchronously. Not relying on this face-to-face synchronous communication. But crucially, I guess my takeaway here is don't rely on seeing people face-to-face. You've got to be able to do the work without that being part of it. It's kind of a trust issue. Hold that thought. I have a book recommendation. I'm recommending this because I'm in it. Lisa interviewed me back in about 2017 when she was writing the book. This is a very practical book. So fortunately, it's also a good book, so I'm comfortable recommending it. Very practical story about how you might resolve the fairly obvious problems with trying to work remote. Very helpful stuff. So this was first extreme technique. The second one is working part-time. Now, I live in the Netherlands where it's fairly common to work part-time. It's becoming a bit more common in this country. But when I first started doing this was when I'd transitioned from being a developer to being a product manager, which is the work I do now. And then my new boss, my new VP of product said, you can't work part-time as a product manager. That is ridiculous. This is that 10 hours a day job. Anyway, we don't work together anymore. It turns out that really worked for me. So since 2015, I've worked 4 or 4.5 days a week. And this is the most indulgent gift I've ever given myself in my life, because it means I've got time and I've got flexibility. So personally, I use this to have a different schedule every week. Some people prefer routine. You do you. But what I really discovered from this is that life's too short to only be working. And I get a lot out of my side projects. So it gives me time for reading and blogging and going to conferences and writing conference presentations, because a presentation like this, you've got to write it at some point. But it also means a different kind of thing. Like some weeks, I just spend my extra half day, because I work 4.5 days a week now. I spend it on either getting up late or leaving early or going for a walk in the middle of the day because it's nice weather. Ultimately, these things add up to me personally to more happiness. So as far as I can tell, working part-time is a happiness issue, and I recommend happiness. Happiness is great. How might you get there? You've got to be able to prioritize. Now, the good news is, as a product manager, prioritization is more or less my job. So if I can't prioritize down to 4.5 days, then why would 5 days be better? I'd still be, not doing it. But you need an employer that goes along with this, and it's a different employer relationship when they're happy for you to have a life outside work. So I recommend that kind of employer. It's flexibility that works both ways. And there's a link, again, to asynchronous work. You need the asynchronous work because you might not be there synchronously online at the time because it's your part-time day. And I discovered that in the remote-first companies, lots of people work part-time. Now, what if that's not a coincidence? So let's go more on asynchronous work. Not working asynchronously, so working synchronously, is really painful, especially if you're a programmer trying to concentrate. Now, there's a website that you should all know, knowhello.net. Who knows about this website? Who has used it? Who has sent the URL to somebody in a chat message? Yes, this is what this website is for. Because somebody, let's call him Keith, apparently. Keith sends you this message that just says hi. Don't be like Keith. Now, I'm not saying that you should passive-aggressively send this URL, nohello.net, in reply to Keith's hi message. I'm also not saying you shouldn't do that. Anyway, so when people want to work synchronously, they want all of the interactions to be synchronous, like a telephone call. That really slows everything down. Some people want to work that way. Those people don't work for remote-first companies because they can't work async. My experience working async was that a lot of the work happens like this, and the result is way fewer meetings. And way fewer meetings is a really big win. I like that. I like fewer meetings. I mean, partly having shorter meetings helps as well, and maybe writing a few things down so that we don't need to kind of exchange all of the information verbally, which is really quite slow when you come to it. We can read much faster than that. Of course, the catch is you've got to write that stuff down. So this is an important question to ask yourself as a developer. You know, you're programmers, you hate reading and writing and anything that feels like documentation. The question is, do you hate it more than meetings? I can't answer that for you. Only you can answer that. As a product manager, it used to be very worse. So product management is a very meeting-oriented job. I used to have 5 hours of meetings every day. This has improved. I now have maybe 5 hours a week, and that's great. I mean, that's like most programmers, maybe. If you have more than 5 hours of meetings a week as a programmer, there is a better place. You do not currently work in the good place. So, more thinking, fewer meetings, and this turns out to be more inclusive. Meetings, especially face-to-face ones, especially with a meeting table that's not circular, but maybe a long rectangle, these are not inclusive places. And when you work asynchronously, it's less about doing this kind of performance in a meeting, in a physical meeting. Now, by performance, I mean showing off. My former colleague Duke explained this. They said, this is less showing off and more showing up for each other. We work together in one of these remote-first companies, the two of us, on the same team. So less performance, less performative work, more just doing the work. And the showing up for each other thing turns out to be important as well as interesting. So how do you work asynchronously? You need to stop relying on meetings. You need to work out why you have meetings and figure out, is there another way you could do that without the meeting? A lot of the time there is. It takes everybody collectively to go along with the idea that you could do that. But your reward is fewer meetings, and that's something I think we all want in our weeks. Fewer meetings mean you can be, I don't know, at the beach or something, doing Slack on your telephone. Sorry, that's just the product manager. Sorry, not sorry. Anyway, but if you can get away from this assumption that everything is better face-to-face, such a cliche, but it's better face-to-face. In what ways is the work better not face-to-face? There's more than one kind of better. Catch is, changing habits is hard. But you can start today with learning to communicate better, more honestly, in text, learn to type faster, or just learn to use reaction emoji on Slack like a person who's expert in that. You should do that. So, work remote, work part-time, work async. These things go together quite well. I've enjoyed those. As a product manager, I started thinking about what else can I do? One of the things that changed the nature of the work, this is a more practical thing about doing software development day to day. I realized, I would like to have a short backlog. If I go back some years, long time ago, because I've been doing software development for a long time, but let's say you go back 20 years, then it's quite normal to have, using this shiny new tool that's just been released called Jira, and have thousands of issues in it because you could, and record every idea anybody had had and put it as a new feature in Jira, because that was very satisfying, and you got to kind of play with Jira, and then configure it and stuff. And then you'd start doing, better testing and collect all of these bug reports, and then you'd have like thousands of known bugs in Jira. Wonderful. You're never going to fix them all. So at a certain point, I thought, can we just not do that? The experience I've had was that it turns out to be possible to have stuff that's in progress, or there's a pull request or a merge request, stuff that's up next. Up next is your backlog. What if the up next backlog only had, let's say, max 10 things in it? Enough work for a couple of weeks, or however long my product manager holiday is. If I'm going on holiday for 2 weeks, maybe I'll put a few more things in there. And if you've got this really short backlog, all you need to do is to check in once a week with the team. Do you know what you're doing next week? You don't need to, at the task level, at the development task level or the user story level, however you work, you don't really need to look further forward than a week or two. There are no sprints in my life here. It's just sort of tomorrow and next week. And one of the wonderful things about this is it's much easier to decide to work on something next week if next week is currently empty. If next week is currently full and the 51 weeks after that are currently full with development tasks, then you probably have to have a meeting about changing the plan, and you don't want to have meetings. So a short backlog means that any changes into the unplanned future don't require a meeting. That's great. So this was part of my sort of journey of taking on product management, where you start to do things like decouple feature requests from a development backlog. Let's say your CEO says, I've got this great idea for a new feature. You nod, smile, and say, yes, that's an excellent idea. But what you don't do is put it straight on the development backlog, because that's how you end up with 10 years worth of work in one afternoon added to Jira. I mean, if you can type that fast, but yeah, sure, why not? Instead, capture customer feedback, but keep it away from the development backlog. Don't do that just yet. But that's a product management conversation. Maybe you should have a product manager who does that for you. But crucially, this idea that if you haven't piled up the backlog, then you can have a short lead time. The time from something being added to the time it's actually done. I mean, if something was added, but you're not going to start it for 6 months, then your lead time is 6 months plus however long it actually takes to do the work, whether that's a day or two. So that was my experience, that this simplified the work a lot. Having fewer than 20 open tasks on a development board means you don't need a fancy tool. Jira is made for managing thousands of tasks with thousands of people. What if there's just 5 of you and you've got 20 tasks? Any tool is good enough now, anything. It doesn't really matter, it's just too simple a problem. I'm not saying you shouldn't have fancy tools though, but you have more choice. So my conclusion here, my takeaway was that it's really great to not waste time. And to leave space for new things, leave space for opportunities. So a long backlog is waste. It's like a warehouse full of inventory that you're never going to sell. Look at your backlog. Imagine your backlog. Think about it. How many of those features are you ever going to implement in your lifetime, realistically? Now, what would you need to be able to do this? I mean, this connects with a few other things. I've mentioned product management, which often includes techniques for having high-level goals that are not at the user story level. Quarterly goals. Because just because you have a short backlog, that doesn't mean you don't have a plan. You do need to know what you're trying to do this year, by the end of this year. What do you think you're going to do next year? It's just it doesn't need to be so detailed. It's not, the answer to what are we doing next year is not a list of user stories or features. It's a different kind of answer. What kind of answer is that? Well, it's not a list of features, it's a list of candidate problems to work on. Now, one of the techniques for candidate problems to work on is objectives and key results. So objectives and key results are one of the things that made, in my case, a short backlog possible. But you need some kind of high-level goal so that you don't have to put everything in this one backlog. Have a separate roadmap. My experience with using OKRs was, you just focus one quarter at a time and you say, these are 2 to 3 things we are going to work on this quarter. There are lots of different things you could call the things, but let's call them goals. Lots of other names, that doesn't really matter. And this turns out to, the experience was good. This was something I could co-create with the whole team. We could start at the problem level and not have to go further and say, what are the features? You can sort of generate the feature designs on the fly as you work through the quarter. That's what you work with the team for, to design the solution. At the start of the quarter, you haven't decided what you're going to build yet. You've just decided what problems are worth working on. That simplifies the work a lot. So reframe work around the problems worth solving, And this is a focus tool. A focus tool means you don't have to be thinking about, the next 20 problems to work on or some whole feature list. So you reframe on this outcome you want to achieve, solving a particular problem. Like, we want more signups from customers, or we want bigger orders in the web shop, that kind of stuff. Not features. You're not planning features, you're planning problems. This turns out to work quite well with external stakeholders, the CEO, the business people, because they don't really want to talk about features. They don't really care about software features. If you say, look, we're going to talk about product strategy instead of features, then that sounds really good. So you'll get promoted. Do that. How do you do this? When you start talking about problems and you focus, you're reducing other people's need to know what the features are going to be. So you're not there when somebody says, yeah, but I need to know exactly what we're going to get, exactly what features are going to be. And that's not really what they need to know, So that's how you tell it's not working, that you're not talking about features. And the focus part, I didn't put it on the slide, but the focus part is everybody's got ideas every day about what you could be doing. Every day, a coffee machine conversation could give you a year's development work because somebody's come up with some great idea. And it's probably a great idea, but it's much less controversial if you say, that's a wonderful idea, but it's not one of our objectives for this quarter, so we're not going to talk about it now. And you just don't even have to have the conversation. Somebody's got a great idea and they say, no, we should have a meeting to talk about this new referrals program. What if you don't have to have that meeting? Fewer meetings. I've got another book recommendation. I particularly like Radical Focus because it starts with a little mini novel, a fictional account of a Silicon Valley startup. And it's fun, and it's a page turner. It's easy to read, and it introduces the problem. This is a bit off topic for programming, but it's more product management. It's an adjacent topic. Maybe you find it interesting. I mention it just because that's a path I went as a programmer. After 20 years, I wanted to do something else. Turns out to be not only being the product manager, but being an available product manager. So the next extreme thing is the idea that your product manager might actually be available when you've got a question. I remember working on Scrum projects, let's say 10 years ago, where I was a Scrum master and I was sort of, putting these impediment kind of cards or stickies on the Scrum board. And used to joke that, there's one that says product owner not available and we should just laminate it so that it lasts for the whole length of the project and we don't have to write it again, because that's always going to be an impediment. Because not only are they not available, but they're in an all-day meeting or something. Here's a controversial idea from Mr. Controversial, Mr. Alan Holub himself on X, suggesting that what if a product owner committed to answering questions within 2 minutes? This would change everything to your experience as a developer. Now, I've not achieved this. It's more likely to take me 10 from time to time. But even trying to do this changes a lot of things. So in this story, I'm the product manager. And I realized that prioritizing team member questions simplifies the work a lot for everybody. And sometimes this should interrupt my meeting. So, I have to apologize to the people I'm in a meeting with, but my team are more important, and I'm going to respond to their Slack messages, maybe. Of course, the killer application here in Slack is that sometimes an emoji reaction is enough. So thumbs up emoji is usually the winning way to unblock a developer because they're making a proposal that's eminently sensible, and I just need to say, yes, do it, go ahead. Or occasionally, panic, no, we've got to talk. So this is about continuous collaboration. Continuous collaboration enables a certain sort of alignment with team members. That means that you make fewer missteps or fewer wrong directions, and that reduces rework a lot. But it's worse than that. It doesn't always reduce the rework, because sometimes it was only a slightly worse choice, not worth redoing, so you just live with it, and then you just have slightly worse quality forever now in your software. And that's worse than having to do the rework to fix it. So the stakes here are the quality of your software, and that's a developer happiness issue. Nobody wants to do bad work. Everybody wants to do their best work. For that to happen, you need to have an available product manager. Now, this is a hard one to achieve, but it's about making everything visible and maybe making the costs of not having this visible. My solution was to become the product manager, so that's a kind of extreme move, I suppose. but at least you can kind of ask for this. So if you're not the product manager in this story, probably, I mean, who's a product manager? I'm thinking nobody, because it's, okay, you're in the wrong conference, I'm sorry. If you're not, so everybody else, you need to talk them into it. So come and see me afterwards, and I'll explain how to bribe your product manager or product owner. Meanwhile, we'll move on, because time's ticking on. One of the other things that I was told was ridiculous. Like, my boss literally shouted at me 2 employers ago. Needless, I don't work there anymore. I said that already. I said, zero bug policy. And he said, that's ridiculous. You can't have a zero bug policy. That's completely not possible. I would like a show of hands. Who works on a piece of software that has at least one known bug? I mean, me too, right? So some of you are asleep, the rest of you have your hand up. But keep your hand up if there are fewer than 10 open bugs. I checked our board to see, this is a not bad number, but maybe this is 5–10%. I checked our board this morning, it's 9, which is not great, but we're working on bugs at the moment. Now, if you have a small number of known open bugs, it turns out that this made the work a lot easier in a couple of ways. Now, the experience was, this seemed like a wild idea, but sometimes in a retrospective, you can propose a wild idea, call it an experiment. The agile coach will say, experiments are great, we like that, and you'll give it a try, and the team will have fun trying this thing. And sometimes you try these things, and you turn out to like it. And we did, and we stuck with it. We fixed all the bugs. And then you get to this point where you usually have either 0, 1, or 2 open bugs. And if it's 1 or 2, then you work on those, and then it goes back to 0 again. And when there were 0 open bugs, there were fewer surprises. There were fewer things that, oh, it's not working because of that bug. And all of those things waste time. The most common way for bugs to waste time is that you have to have meetings about them. And I think we've covered that already, but you get the point, fewer meetings. This idea is super old. So the Joel test, Joel Spolsky's blog post in August 2000, created a list of 12 things to test your future employer with. His idea was that you would ask somebody in a job interview questions, and number 5 is, do you fix bugs before writing new code? Now, some companies might score 4 or 5 out of 10. I mean, that was pretty good. Nobody, I think, ever scored 100%. But I guess some people out there have had this idea for a long time, fix the bugs first, because they waste time. And from my perspective, it turns out that they also break product management. So just as an aside, if we're trying out a new feature idea because we think it's going to make customers give us all of their money, and we release the feature, I want to know if it works. Are the customers giving us all of their money? If it turns out the feature is buggy, then that's probably why it's not working, as opposed to nobody wants that feature, or they hate newsletter pop-ups, or whatever it is we thought was a wonderful idea. So buggy features give you 0 information about their success. That's a bit of a waste of time. This is relevant if you're doing this kind of experimental software development. It doesn't make any difference if you've planned your development tasks years ahead because you're actually doing secret waterfall. You're just going to build everything anyway. You can do the whole project even if nobody needs it. Anyway, so how would you get here? This turns out to be quite the conversation. And every time I've ever suggested 0 bug policy to a bunch of developers, a development team, developers immediately come with all the edge cases. But what if? What if we're doing this and then this happens? The answer is, okay, try not to have that meeting. Just say, look, we're going to fix all the bugs first. And hopefully we hopefully we get through that, because there might be kind of a lot. I don't know, do you want to fix all the bugs? It's not necessarily the most fun work, but it is very satisfying. And the goal is worthy. Anyway, if you've fixed all the bugs, then at that point, you can deal with each bug report case by case. You don't really it's not really a policy. You don't have a policy for how to handle bugs, because you just discuss them individually and decide fix it or don't fix it. You don't fix every bug, by the way. You might decide that this one's not worth fixing. After all, if a customer never saw it, maybe it didn't really happen. You make this choice, but you don't save it for later. It's like fix it or don't fix it. There is no later. That's the essence of the idea. And this creates some interesting conversations, but mostly it requires a bit of honesty about how this is actually going to work, what you're going to accept, what you're going to fix or not fix, what are the consequences for the work you're not doing instead, like adding loads of new features, which looks great, except they're all buggy and you're never going to fix those bugs. And now you have crappy software. These conversations are worth having, and these are worth having as developers. This is also potentially one that as developers you can bottom-up introduce. Bribe your product owner, product manager, and say, look, we're going to fix all the bugs first. Maybe even fix some tech debt while you're at it. Okay, next up. What was the most controversial extreme programming technique? Any thoughts while I have a sip of water? Nobody. In my experience, it was pair programming. That got the managers the most upset. You know, you're going to do half as much work, and you're just going to, like, I don't know, sit around telling programming jokes instead of actually working, or something. I can't remember. A long time ago. If pair programming becomes acceptable, obviously you need to just dial the volume up to 11 and do team programming, sometimes called ensemble programming, maybe mob programming, which are not great metaphors. But the idea is that, you know, instead of just a pair, you do the same thing, but with the whole team. Pair programming turned up to 11. This turned out to be quite fun. I mean, we started it occasionally. We didn't go full on and say, right, you know, we're going to do all production code in the mob, although one of the other teams at the same company used it a lot more. But we realized, you know, context, we're working fully remote. We've reduced the number of meetings, but we like hanging out together as a team. But we don't have a meeting to hang out together because then it would be kind of a waste of time. And we realized that team programming was also fun. And if you start with a few people, oh, we're going to do a team programming session, everybody else in the team gets FOMO and they all show up. And then you have this really quite nice, wholesome group activity where you actually get loads of work done. Because like pair programming, everything is easy when confronted, you know, with the whole team. Turns out to be quite a lot of fun. I even quite enjoyed it as a product manager. I mean, I went along thinking, oh, they have loads of questions to ask me. Not true. I mean, occasionally, you know, there might be one question in the middle of a 1 hour session that saved some time. Maybe it was worth attending just for that. But, you know, just quite enjoyed spending a bit more time with the team. It was helpful in other ways. Now, team programming itself is a very specific technique. Some people have a very strict approach to how it works. That's great. If you don't want to do that, or you try it and it doesn't work for you, you can just have an open video chat session and just kind of co-work together. You know, like just put the video channel on. So there are teams who just leave an open video channel all day because they're not co-located. You know, and at least then you can hear, you know, your colleagues sort of swearing at their mouse when they've got some horrible bug that they've been staring at for hours and realized it was a semicolon or whatever it is. That can help. That can be fun too, because, you know, just because you have fewer meetings, you might like each other if things are going well as a team. I mean, all of this is irrelevant if you don't like each other. So that turns out to be an important thing here. Yeah, how do you adopt team programming? Like, how do you get here? Well, you would need to start off with an environment where people want to work together instead of alone. And so that's starting to feel like a really big, tough prerequisite now. And I've been going through, and some of these things are linked together, but this one, actually, like many of the others, you need to like working together. So this is the point in which, in my story, collecting these examples of extreme practices, I realized that the last two would be the most extreme of all, and were not the ones I was expecting. It turns out that to make these things work, you need to work on building trustful relationships. Now, the first time I kind of came across this phrase, it felt a bit weird, but I went with it. I just joined a new company. And there was a lot of top-down leadership about this. Company founders explaining that this was something they cared about, that it would require getting better at communication and feedback, and also delegating a lot of actual decision-making. You know, demanding that teams would make a lot of their own decisions. This went quite far. We got to do a lot of stuff at the team level. There were still limits. I mean, there were still layoffs in the end because it's a startup. You know, you're not family anymore. You're fired now. So, you know, don't exaggerate this. But this was a different approach to the employer-employee relationship. It did feel uncomfortable at first. It felt, I don't know, new age or whatever you want to call it. But I came to realize that if you don't have this, whatever you call it, you're not really working together. You're working despite each other or against each other or competing or of the many flavors of toxic relationship. You know, they like, you know, happy teams are all the same, you know, but it's the unhappy teams, they're unique. I think that's right, right? So building these trustful relationships is quite uncomfortable. It's not easy. It's also uncomfortable for the leaders, in the other direction as well. But because it's really the bottom line of how well we work together, you realize that not having this leads to lots of problems, lots of noise in your work, things that we sometimes call politics or bad colleague or whatever. But ultimately, these are systemic issues that come down to not actually addressing the things that create good working relationships. How did this happen? It started at the top, like I said, came from company founders, was made explicit, had to be explicit because we were fully remote. Remember I said everything has to be explicit. It's literally in the handbook. There has to be an environment where you talk about this and you do the work. And in particular, it's about feedback. That's a very important part. Recognizing the importance and difficulty of learning to give and receive good feedback. So here I've got a couple more book recommendations. The first is a sort of smallish introductory book, very easy read. But this was recommended by one of the company founders in a webinar that I watched before my first interview at the company. It helped me ace the interview because I knew where they were coming from by reading this over the weekend. So that was a good move, got the job. That was made me happy at the time. And it really expresses an approach to work that might seem quite extreme, dare I say it. Like I said, very short and readable book. It combines a number of ideas that you might have read in other books. So if you read this kind of book, like if you've read things like Drive by Daniel Pink, which is a book about motivation, you'll recognize that, oh, you've already read a third of this book, and a couple of other things. Another book that, well, I'll come to the slide. In the same company, a year or so later, we got our company Christmas present, and the same founder got everybody in the company a copy of Radical Candor, which is quite a bold move to give a book like this to everybody in the company. This is a harder book. This really goes to the heart of what is good feedback and how would you do it and how do you get through the discomfort of this, both as an employee and as a leader. And while it's hard to put into the practice, like we had a book club and went through it, struggled with it in a way, it definitely nudged us all in the right direction. So if you're curious about what is hard to do in working relationships, I recommend this. But you need to be quite into this kind of topic to really enjoy reading this book to start to finish. Otherwise, start with one of the simpler ones. Now, feedback turns out to be an important topic. So this is a book about feedback, particularly, how to do it honestly, but also sensitively. Because we've all experienced bad feedback. I think my favorite example of this is this tweet about dressing for the job you want. And not every employer really wants you to make, honest suggestions. So, your employer needs to actually want honest conversations. I suppose the good news I have for you, if you've got a technical career that's going well, you have a lot of choice about where you work. So what's this about? This is an example of the absence of psychological safety. The belief that you won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. That's Wikipedia. Worth looking at that page if you're not very familiar with the idea. I got here unexpectedly when preparing this presentation because I started with the other topics, the more practical ones and the product management things and the team things. And then I noticed that some of them had sort of dependencies on some of the others. I mean, not completely. There's not a neat hierarchy here. Very disappointing. But like I said, working remote first and part-time require being able to work async. If you want to have zero bug policy, there's not much point if you don't have a short backlog as well. It's not really going to work. And when I prepared thinking about, okay, I'm not going to tell you how to do this, but I'm going to give you all some hints about what might be necessary for these things, I realized that all of them depend on psychological safety, which is awkward because that's kind of a difficult thing to get to. So my takeaway from several years of work now is that you can get to psychological safety if you work on it. I was very lucky to work in a team that was prepared to do the work with a coach who would facilitate retrospectives where we did the work. He had a retrospective technique he'd often use on us that was quite tough in a way. I was used to retro formats where you would go through a bunch of topics. You do things like boat retro, where which topics are the wind, which topics the anchor, all that kind of stuff. He did the table retro. He would designate one person at random in the team, and he'd say, you need to pick one of these topics we've identified, put that topic on the table, and that is the only topic we are going to address. There's no hiding by moving on to another topic. My experience was confusing to me at first. We seemed to be spending months talking about personal tensions, which was an odd phrase, and our working relationships. And we weren't talking about software development process or agile software development, all of the method stuff. But we seemed to have productivity issues. It didn't really feel like the work was flowing or going fast. But, everybody knew what they were doing, and I was in it for the long term, so we did the work together. And it was pretty much a year spent resolving these tensions after I joined what I was warned would be a troubled team. We resolved all the tensions by doing the work. We resolved all of the relationship problems. And then I realized that all of the productivity problems had gone away as well, which in hindsight is completely not a surprise. But for me, it was quite the revelation, having had such a process background, having been the Scrum Master who'd memorized all of the agile software development books, to realize that, that whole time I'd been missing this factor, the factor of psychological safety. So it turns out that not only does extreme product development depend on having psychological safety, but actually maybe all work always has. And everything else, if you don't have it, you get lots of noise that is very distracting. So all work, in the broadest sense, all of your productivity, all of the results, depend on psychological safety. Some years ago, I think it was Google did a big study. Was it Google? It's difficult to look up because the online resources have gone. Big study about, what do the high-performing teams have in common? And it's not their experience or their skills. It turns out to be, essentially, do they have psychological safety? I'm summarizing. Now, this, I found, was a difficult topic to get into. I found these slides quite hard to prepare. I didn't know what I'd want to say at first. But I realized that one of the things, you can start small. You can start with a simple idea. So I've got a book recommendation, which is worth it just for the cover of the book. The No Arsehole Rule is a business book whose title tells you half of the content. Even if you read nothing else, you've got the idea already. Turns out the book is actually worth reading as well, because the next level is it's got a better structure to it and explains what that means. And then it's got a bunch of stories that actually explain it a bit, anecdotes. It's not a long book. This is quite a quick read. This is a read in a weekend or on a transatlantic flight kind of book. And it's not the whole topic, but if you read something like this and it gets you thinking about where you work and you know who the people are, well, hopefully you do, because if you read this book and you think, I don't work with anybody like that, it's probably you. So that's awkward. You know how they say that every Slack channel, every team Slack channel has a parallel private Slack channel, which is all of the same people except for one person. And if you think that's not true, I've got bad news for you. The lesson here is that you don't need an alternative to a bad practice. You just stop doing the bad thing. Improving the health of how you work creates space for doing the right thing. You all know what doing the right thing is. That's not the hard part. It's being able to do it. It's having the right environment, and that's the harder thing. So again, to repeat, the hardest work in all of these things was the psychological safety work that made the other things possible. And some of them are quite easy once you've done the prerequisites. If doing things like introducing a zero bug policy is hard, you probably need to go back a few steps, I realize. I started thinking about, what can I say about how you might get there with psychological safety? And this sentence from an article on some random website, I don't know, is something I identified with. Essentially, once you've stopped doing the bad behaviors, then if you just work together in a normal way, that's a bonding experience. Think back to the team programming session I described. That's an example of if you just do that without then doing any bad things, that experience starts to create the feeling of bonding together that results over a longer period in trust and psychological safety. So that's a sort of a simpler example. But that very act of being productive and doing the work together is a big part of how you get there. It's also why you can't rush it. So yeah, because of that then, my summary is, do the work to reduce the noise of all of the dealing with the consequences of not having the psychological safety. The meeting is about the problematic person who you're having a conflict with. Because if you've done that work, then you can do your job, which is number 2. Achieve your professional goals. And you don't have to do other things. There's no 3 politics, 4 whatever. Create space to just do the work you want to do. So I'm as surprised as you are about what my conclusion turns out to be on this topic. I mean, there are some interesting ways of working as a software developer that are possible and they exist. But it turns out to get there, you have to pursue psychological safety. Not a bad thing because it's a happiness issue, and developer happiness is a much neglected idea. We should be happy in our jobs. I say this unironically. I think the next step, I think my call to action for today is to have conversations about this stuff. Talk about it, normalize talking about it, get used to the things that might feel uncomfortable or weird. Because that's how you can create the situation where you can start to make progress. And exploring what people think is extreme has, helped me kind of raise some interesting questions. Why is somebody reacting so strongly to something that actually sounds quite good fun? I'm going to end again with another reaction from my former colleague Duke, who, when I talked about this and showed the slides last week, they concluded that yes, if you create this right environment, people are amazing in their creativity when they realize they have the power to change things. When you have the power to change things, when you actually have that power, is what it's like when you have psychological safety. That's agency right there. That's all I have time for today. There's some more of this stuff on my blog. Some of these topics are articles by themselves. Follow me on Twitter. That will make me happy. Sorry, X, you know what I mean. And invite me to speak at your company or conference if I can get there by train from the Netherlands, because I don't like airports anymore. Thank you very much.